1943, North Africa. Italian women prisoners of war were served their first meal in an American camp, golden cornbread with butter and honey, and they laughed and discussed, refusing to eat what they thought was animal feed beneath their dignity. But when hunger finally made one young nurse take a single bite, her face went pale, and she whispered words that would shatter everything Mussolini had told them about America. What did she discover in that moment that made her weep 2 years later when she returned to a starving Italy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1943 burned across Italy like a fever that wouldn't break. In Naples, Luisa Martinelli stood in line for bread at dawn, just as she had done every morning for the past 3 years. She was 24 years old, a trained military nurse, and she had not seen real butter since 1940. The ration card in her pocket allowed her family 200 grams of bread per day. That was less than half a pound to split between 4 people. Once a week, if they were lucky, they might get a tiny portion of meat. Olive oil, which had once flowed freely in every Italian kitchen, had become more precious than gold. Luisa wore her crisp uniform with pride. She believed in Il Duce, in Mussolini's vision of a new Roman Empire. The government told them they were winning the war. The radio announced victory after victory. Yes, times were hard, but sacrifice was noble. The enemy nations were suffering far worse, the newspapers promised. America was weak and falling apart, still broken from their Great Depression. Britain was starving under German bombs. Japan was invincible in the Pacific. Italy would triumph, and then the plenty would return. She reported to the military hospital that morning, her stomach tight with hunger. The night shift nurses looked hollow-eyed and thin. Everyone looked thin now. In the supply room, bandages had to be washed and reused. Medicine was running low. Coffee was made from roasted barley because real coffee beans hadn't arrived in months. But Luisa kept her back straight and her face calm. A good fascist woman did not complain. A good Italian served her country without question. 200 miles south in Sicily, 19-year-old Giovanna Costa sat at her radio desk in a military communications post. Her fingers were swift on the telegraph keys, sending coded messages between command posts. She had grown up on a small farm where her family grew olives and lemons. That life felt like a dream now. The war had taken her 2 brothers. The farm had been damaged in a bombing raid. Her mother's last letter said they were eating grass soup to survive. Grass, boiled in water with a pinch of salt. Giovanna had volunteered for military service because, at least in the army, she got fed. Not well, but better than civilians. She told herself she was serving a greater purpose. The propaganda posters on the communication post walls showed strong Italian soldiers and happy families under fascist rule. The posters showed tables heavy with food and wine. Giovanna looked at those posters and tried not to feel angry, tried not to wonder why the Italy in the pictures looked nothing like the Italy outside her window. Then came July 1943, and everything collapsed faster than anyone could have imagined. Allied forces landed in Sicily. The invasion was massive and swift. Within weeks, Mussolini fell from power. The government that had promised victory for 3 years simply crumbled. Italian forces, already exhausted and poorly supplied, surrendered in waves. Luisa's hospital was captured by British forces in one chaotic morning. Giovanna's communication post was overrun by American soldiers before she could even destroy her equipment. They became prisoners of war. Not soldiers, really, but women in military service. Nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, telephone workers. Thousands of them, suddenly enemy combatants in the eyes of the Allies. The British processed them quickly,
but there were too many prisoners and not enough camps in North Africa. Within weeks, Louisa and Giovanna, who had never met before, found themselves on the same transport ship heading west across the Atlantic Ocean.
The journey took 3 weeks. The women were kept below deck in converted cargo holds. The ship rolled and pitched. Many were seasick. They had no idea where they were going. Some whispered they would be taken to Britain and forced to work in factories. Others feared worse. The propaganda they had been fed for years said that Americans were cruel and barbaric, that they treated prisoners like animals. Louisa tried to keep the other women calm, but she felt the fear in her own chest like a cold stone. When they finally arrived at a port in Virginia, the summer heat hit them like a wall. They were loaded onto trains, and the trains rolled west for days. Through the windows, the women saw something that confused them. America was supposed to be suffering. America was supposed to be weak and broken from economic depression. But the farms they passed looked healthy. The towns looked whole. There were cars on the roads, many cars. The trains stopped at stations where American civilians walked around with packages and bags, not looking thin or desperate.
"It's propaganda," Louisa told the younger woman. "They're showing us only the good parts. The real America must be hidden away somewhere." But doubt had begun to creep in. Giovanna pressed her face to the train window and counted the cars in a parking lot. More than 20. In her entire village in Sicily, there had been maybe 3 cars total before the war. She said nothing, but something cold was forming in her stomach, something that felt like the first crack in a dam. The train carried them to Arizona, to a place called Camp Florence. When they stepped off the train into the desert heat, the women expected to see barbed wire and guard towers with machine guns. They did see fences, yes, and guards, but the camp looked almost like a small town. There were barracks painted white to reflect heat. There were trees planted in rows for shade. There was a medical building with a red cross painted on the roof. There was even a recreation yard with benches. An American officer, speaking through an Italian translator, explained the camp rules. The women would be housed in barracks. They would be assigned work details, light duty only. They would receive 3 meals per day. They would be allowed to send letters home, though the letters would be censored. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war. Medical care would be provided. They were not to be abused or mistreated. Louisa listened and waited for the trick. There was always a trick. The fascist government had made many promises too, and most of them had been lies. That first evening, the women were led to a dining hall. The building was large and clean, with ceiling fans turning slowly overhead. Long tables were set with metal trays. American women in civilian clothes worked in the kitchen area, and the smell coming from there made Giovanna's knees weak. It smelled like cooking meat. Real meat. Not the thin broth they called soup back home. Not the mysterious gray substance that came in cans. Actual cooking meat. The prisoners sat at the tables, whispering nervously to each other. Then the American kitchen workers began serving. On each tray, a portion of beans cooked with pieces of pork, a serving of some kind of greens, a cup of milk, real milk, white and cold, and a square of something golden yellow that steamed slightly.
Louisa stared at her tray. The portions were larger than anything she had seen in 3 years. The milk alone would have been a luxury. She picked up the golden square and examined it. It was warm, with a rough texture. It smelled slightly sweet and grainy. "What is this?" she asked the woman next to her. An older prisoner who spoke some English had asked the kitchen worker. "She says it's bread, cornbread." Louisa turned the square over in her hands. "This is bread? But it's yellow, and it's crumbling. This isn't bread. This is—" She laughed, and the laugh was bitter and tired. "This is what you feed to animals.
Corn is for pigs and chickens, not people. Around the table, other women examined their cornbread with the same confusion and disgust. One woman set hers down and refused to touch it. Another sniffed it suspiciously. Giovanna, who had grown up on a farm, knew that in Sicily, corn was indeed grown mainly for animal feed. Humans ate wheat bread when they could get wheat. Corn was beneath human dignity.
"They're mocking us," someone said, "giving us animal feed." Louisa felt anger rise in her chest. After everything, after the defeat and the humiliation of capture, now they were being served food meant for livestock? She pushed the cornbread to the edge of her tray and ate only the beans and greens, though her stomach screamed for more. But then Mrs. Henderson, one of the American kitchen workers, noticed the untouched cornbread. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray streaks in her brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She saw the prisoners pushing the golden squares aside and understood immediately. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 small bowls, one containing butter and one containing honey. Through the translator, she explained, "This is cornbread. It's a traditional American food. You eat it like this." She took a piece of cornbread, broke it open to show the steaming interior, and spread butter on it. The butter melted into the warm bread. Then she drizzled honey over it. "Try it this way." Giovanna watched the butter melt and disappear into the bread. Butter. When had she last seen real butter? Her grandmother used to make butter when Giovanna was small, churning milk in a wooden barrel. That was before the war, before everything changed. She looked at the golden bread with its melted butter and honey, and suddenly, she didn't care about dignity anymore. She was so hungry, so tired of being hungry. She picked up the cornbread and took a small bite. The cornbread was still warm from the oven, and the butter had melted into every little pocket and crack. When Giovanna bit into it, the texture was soft and slightly grainy, nothing like the hard wheat bread she remembered from home. The honey added sweetness that made her eyes close for just a moment. It tasted rich. It tasted like something made with care, with ingredients that didn't need to be rationed or stretched or substituted with sawdust and hope. She chewed slowly, and then her eyes went wide. She looked across the table at Louisa, and her voice came out barely louder than a whisper. "Madonna Santa, there's butter in this, real butter, and it's sweet. How can prison food be sweet?" Louisa watched Giovanna take another bite, then another. The younger woman's hands were shaking slightly. Around the table, other women noticed. One by one, they picked up their cornbread. They added butter and honey as Mrs. Henderson had shown them. They tasted it. The dining hall grew quiet, except for the sound of chewing and the occasional soft gasp of surprise. Louisa felt something crack inside her chest. She picked up her own piece of cornbread, still warm, and took a bite without adding anything to it. Even plain, it was dense and filling. Even plain, it had flavor. This was what the Americans called prison food. This was what they fed to their enemies. She thought about the watery soup her mother had served the last time she was home on leave. She thought about her little sister, who had cried because her stomach hurt from hunger. She took another bite and felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. That first week at Camp Florence passed in a blur of disbelief. Every morning, the women woke to the sound of a bell at 6 o'clock. They washed at sinks with running water that came out clean and clear. Then they walked to the dining hall for breakfast. Breakfast. Not just a cup of ersatz coffee and a thin slice of bread, but actual breakfast. There were eggs, scrambled or fried. There was more cornbread, or sometimes white bread with butter and jam. There was hot cereal with milk and sugar. There was real coffee, dark and strong, and bitter in the best way.
Giovanna stood in the breakfast line on the third morning and counted the eggs on her plate. 2 whole eggs just for her. In Sicily, eggs had become so precious that her mother saved them to trade for other goods. 1 egg could buy a cup of flour. 2 eggs could buy a little cooking oil. And here, in this prison camp in the middle of the Arizona desert, she was being served 2 eggs as if it were nothing special at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lunch came at noon. There was always meat. Sometimes it was sliced ham or beef. Sometimes it was chicken. Once there was fish. The portions were not huge, but they were solid and real. There were always vegetables, even if they came from cans. There was always bread. There was always something to drink. Milk or water or sometimes fruit juice. Dinner was the biggest meal. Stew with chunks of potato and carrot and meat, roasted chicken with gravy, pork chops with applesauce. And always, always there was enough. If a woman finished her plate and was still hungry, she could ask for more. More! Giovanna asked for seconds one evening, her face burning with shame, expecting to be refused or mocked. The American kitchen worker simply smiled and gave her another serving.
"Is it always like this?" Giovanna asked Louisa one night in their barracks. "Do you think they're fattening us up for something? Or maybe this is just the first week, to trick us, and then the real prison food will start?" Louisa had no answer. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of it. The propaganda had been so clear. America was weak. America was falling apart. Americans were desperate and poor and suffering. But if that were true, why were American prisoners eating better than Italian citizens? Why was there so much food that they could give it away to their enemies? The second week brought new surprises. On Sunday afternoon, the women heard a bell ringing outside. Not the regular camp bell, but something musical and cheerful. They went to the windows of their barracks and saw a truck painted white and red pulling into the camp. An American soldier was driving, and he parked near the recreation yard. Other soldiers and some of the kitchen workers gathered around the truck. Mrs. Henderson came to the barracks and, through the translator, invited the Italian women to come outside. They walked into the bright Arizona sunshine, squinting and uncertain. The back of the truck was open, and inside was a machine that hummed and chugged. The soldier behind a small window was scooping something white and creamy into paper cups. "Ice cream," the translator said. "It's frozen sweet cream, a dessert. They're giving it to everyone in camp today, including you." Louisa stood frozen. Ice cream. She remembered ice cream from childhood, from before the war, from a shop in Naples where her father had taken her on her 8th birthday. That felt like a lifetime ago, like something from a fairy tale. And now, in a prison camp, a truck had arrived just to give away frozen dessert to prisoners of war. She accepted the paper cup with both hands. The ice cream was pale yellow and speckled with dark spots. "Vanilla," the soldier said in English, pointing to his own cup. Louisa took a small taste with the wooden spoon they had given her. It was cold and sweet and rich, melting on her tongue. She took another bite and then the cup was empty and she wanted to cry. Giovanna ate her ice cream so fast she got a sharp pain in her forehead. She pressed her hand to her head and laughed, actually laughed, at the strange cold ache. When had she last laughed? When had anything been funny or light or good? The ice cream truck drove away after everyone had been served, and the Italian women stood in the recreation yard in small groups, holding their empty paper cups as if they were made of gold. The third week, they were assigned to work details. The camp commander explained that, according to the rules of war, prisoners could be required to work, but only at jobs that did not directly support the enemy's military. The Italian women would work in the camp laundry, cleaning sheets and uniforms and towels for the camp population. Louisa expected to spend her days bent over washboards, scrubbing by hand in cold water, as she had seen her mother do at home. Instead, she was led into a large building filled with machines. Huge metal washing machines, bigger than anything she had ever seen, churned loads of laundry with hot water and soap. There were drying machines that tumbled the wet clothes until they came out warm and fluffy. There were ironing stations with electric irons that heated instantly.
An American woman named Dorothy, who supervised the laundry, showed them how to operate each machine. She was patient and kind, demonstrating each step twice. She spoke slowly so the translator could keep up. When Giovanna accidentally put too much soap in a machine and created a mountain of bubbles that spilled onto the floor, Dorothy just laughed and showed her how to fix it. There was no yelling, no punishment, just correction and patience. The work was still work, hot and tiring in the Arizona heat, but it was nothing like the back-breaking labor Louisa had feared. The machines did most of the hard work. The women fed sheets into the washers, moved loads to the dryers, folded the clean laundry and sorted it into bins. They worked 4 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon, with a break for lunch. During the lunch break, on their 4th day of work, Dorothy opened her lunch pail and began eating. Giovanna watched from the corner of her eye. The American woman had 2 thick sandwiches with meat and cheese visible between the bread. She had an apple, red and shiny. She had cookies wrapped in waxed paper. She had a thermos full of coffee with real cream. This was a working woman's lunch. Not a rich woman, not a special occasion, just an ordinary Tuesday lunch for an ordinary worker.
Giovanna thought about her mother's grass soup. She thought about her village where children fought over orange peels. She looked at Dorothy's apple and felt something shift in her understanding of the world. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't a show being put on for the prisoners. Dorothy had packed this lunch at home this morning, never thinking that an Italian girl would be watching and having her entire worldview shattered by the sight of a red apple. Dorothy noticed Giovanna staring. She reached into her lunch pail and pulled out a second apple, smaller than the first. She held it out to Giovanna with a smile. "Here, honey, I've got another one at home." Giovanna took the apple with shaking hands. Another one at home, as if apples were common, as if having extra food was normal. She bit into the apple, and it was crisp and sweet and perfect. She ate it down to the core, down to the seeds, not wanting to waste a single bite. That night in the barracks, Giovanna couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk and listened to the other women breathing in the darkness. She thought about Dorothy saying she had another apple at home. She thought about the ice cream truck that came just to give away dessert. She thought about the breakfast eggs and the lunch meat and the dinner portions that were always enough. In Naples, Louisa's family was eating 200 grams of bread per day. In Sicily, Giovanna's mother was boiling grass. Here in this prison camp in Arizona, the enemy was serving 3 full meals a day to captured Italian women, and on Sundays they brought ice cream. Louisa finally spoke into the darkness, her voice quiet but clear. "They're not starving. America isn't starving. We were told they were suffering worse than us. We were told they were weak and broken, but they have so much food they can give it to their prisoners. They have so much that their workers carry extra apples. Giovanna, what if everything we were told was a lie?" No one answered, but Giovanna knew they were all awake. They were all thinking the same thing. The cornbread had been the first crack in the wall. Now the wall was starting to crumble, piece by piece, and they were beginning to see what was on the other side. What they saw was abundance. What they saw was a country so wealthy, so powerful, that feeding its enemies was barely an afterthought. And that realization was more terrifying than any punishment could have been. The months passed in a strange rhythm that felt nothing like prison and nothing like war. October came to the Arizona desert, bringing cooler temperatures and clear blue skies. The Italian women settled into their routines. They worked in the laundry. They ate their 3 meals. They wrote letters home that were censored but still allowed. Some women took English classes that were offered twice a week. Others learned to play softball in the recreation yard, a game they had never seen before, but which made them laugh and run and forget for a little while that they were thousands of miles from home. Louisa found herself working alongside Mrs. Henderson more and more often. The older American woman had taken a special interest in teaching the Italian prisoners to cook American food. She showed them how to make biscuits and gravy, how to fry chicken properly, how to bake apple pie. Louisa watched and learned, her hands remembering the motions even as her mind struggled with the amounts. A whole cup of sugar for one pie, a stick of butter used without hesitation, cream poured freely into mashed potatoes. The abundance was casual, thoughtless, normal. One morning in late October, Mrs. Henderson mentioned that Thanksgiving was coming in November. Through the translator, she explained that it was a holiday where Americans gave thanks for their blessings and ate a special meal together. The camp commander had decided that the prisoners would be included in the Thanksgiving celebration. There would be a feast. Giovanna had heard the word before, had seen it in her English lessons, but she didn't understand what it meant. A feast? In a prison camp? For prisoners of war? It made no sense. Surely there was a trick, some catch she wasn't seeing. November arrived with cold mornings and warm afternoons. The women were issued warmer jackets, real wool coats that kept out the chill. On the morning of Thanksgiving, they were told that work duties were canceled for the day. They should rest and clean up for the meal that evening. The dining hall would be decorated. There would be special food. They should come hungry. That evening, the women walked to the dining hall and stopped at the entrance, stunned. The room had been transformed. Someone had hung paper decorations from the ceiling in orange and brown and gold. There were autumn leaves scattered on the tables, real ones that must have been brought from somewhere far away because nothing grew leaves like that in the Arizona desert. Candles flickered in glass holders. The tables were set with real plates instead of the usual metal trays, and there were cloth napkins folded beside each plate. American soldiers and camp staff were already seated at some tables, talking and laughing. The Italian women were directed to their own tables, but they were in the same room, eating the same meal. Prisoners and guards together. Enemies at the same feast. The food came out on large serving platters that were passed around the tables. First came the turkey, huge roasted birds with golden brown skin that had been carved into slices. There was stuffing, bread mixed with herbs and celery and onions. There were mashed potatoes with butter melting in them. There was gravy, thick and rich and brown. There were green beans with slivers of almonds. There was cranberry sauce, sweet and tart and jewel red. There were soft white rolls with more butter. There was corn, not cornbread this time, but actual kernels of sweet corn in cream sauce. Giovanna filled her plate and then stared at it. There was more food on this single plate that her entire family would see in a week, maybe in a month. She picked up her fork, but her hand was shaking so badly she had to put it down again. Across the table, she saw tears running down another woman's face, but the woman was eating anyway, crying and eating at the same time. Louisa took a bite of turkey, and it was tender and juicy and perfectly seasoned. She took a bite of stuffing, and it was savory and warm. She ate mashed potatoes and the gravy and green beans. She ate until her stomach was full, really full. Not just the absence of hunger, but actual satisfied fullness. And still there was more food on her plate. Then came the dessert. 3 kinds of pie were brought out on carts. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream, apple pie with a lattice crust, pecan pie, sticky and sweet with a filling like caramel. Each woman was given a slice of each. 3 pieces of pie. 3. Louisa ate 1 bite of the pumpkin pie, and then she couldn't eat anymore. Not because she was full, though she was, not because it didn't taste good, because it was delicious. She couldn't eat because she was crying too hard to swallow. The tears came from somewhere deep inside, somewhere she had locked away for months. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking, and she didn't care who saw.
Mrs. Henderson came over and put a hand on Louisa's shoulder. She didn't say anything, just stood there with her warm hand resting gently on Louisa's back until the crying slowed. Then she handed Louisa a clean handkerchief and said something in English that the translator repeated. "It's all right, dear. You're safe here. You're going to be all right." But Louisa wasn't crying because she felt unsafe. She was crying because she felt the opposite. She was crying because she had been lied to. She was crying because her family was starving in Naples while she ate turkey and 3 kinds of pie in an enemy prison camp. She was crying because the world she thought she understood had been turned completely upside down, and she didn't know how to make sense of anything anymore. That night, back in the barracks, Louisa sat on her bunk with her diary open on her lap. She had been writing in it every week, careful entries that avoided saying anything too dangerous in case the guards read it. But tonight she didn't care. Tonight she needed to write the truth.
She wrote in Italian, her handwriting shaky in the dim light. We were told America was weak, decadent, starving from their depression. But they fed their prisoners, their enemies, better than Mussolini fed his own people. The cornbread I mocked, it had eggs, milk, and butter. When did I last see butter in Naples? 1940? I am angry, not Americans, at the lies. We fought for a government that let us starve while telling us our enemies were starving. She stopped writing and looked up. Giovanna sat on the next bunk, also writing a letter. The younger woman looked up and their eyes met. I'm writing to my mother, Giovanna said quietly. But I don't know what to say. How do I tell her I ate turkey today? How do I tell her there were 3 kinds of pie? She'll think I'm lying. Or worse, she'll believe me and she'll know that I'm eating like a queen while she boils grass soup. How do I live with that? Louisa had no answer. Other women in the barracks were having similar conversations in low voices. They all felt it, the weight of understanding something terrible. They had been fighting for a government that lied to them. They had believed in a cause that was built on propaganda and false promises. They had trusted leaders who sent them to war while doing nothing to feed their families at home.
Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the camp. The Italian women began to see their captivity differently. They were still prisoners, yes. They still couldn't leave. They still missed their families desperately. But they began to understand that being captured might have been the best thing that could have happened to them. Mrs. Henderson spent more time with them, teaching them about American life. She talked about how her own son was fighting in Italy right now. She showed them a photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling at the camera. Giovanna stared at the photograph, trying to process what Mrs. Henderson was telling them. Your son is in Italy? Fighting against Italians? And you're here, cooking for us? Mrs. Henderson nodded, her eyes sad but kind. You're not my enemy, honey. You're just girls who got caught up in men's wars. My boy isn't fighting you personally. He's fighting against the men who started this whole mess. There's a difference between a government and its people. You didn't ask for this war any more than my son did.
This idea was revolutionary to Giovanna. In fascist Italy, the government and the people were supposed to be one thing, united under Il Duce. To separate them, to say that a person could disagree with their government, that seemed almost like treason. But Mrs. Henderson said it so casually, as if it were obvious and normal. In America, Mrs. Henderson continued through the translator, we choose our leaders. If we don't like what they do, we can vote them out and choose different ones. The government works for the people, not the other way around. Louisa absorbed these words like water in dry ground. Choose their leaders. Vote them out. The government works for the people. These were concepts she had never truly considered before. In Italy, you didn't question il duce. You didn't criticize the government. You believed and obeyed and served. That was what a good Italian did.
But what good had it done? Where had all that loyalty gotten them? Their country was in ruins. Their families were starving. They had lost the war and lost their dignity and lost years of their lives. And for what? The camp offered vocational training to prisoners who wanted to learn new skills. Some women took typing classes. Others learned bookkeeping. Louisa signed up for the cooking classes, wanting to learn more from Mrs. Henderson. Giovanna took English lessons 3 times a week now, studying with an intensity that surprised everyone. One day, as Louisa helped prepare dinner in the camp kitchen, Mrs. Henderson taught her how to make cornbread from scratch. The recipe was simple, but required ingredients that were precious in Italy and common in America: cornmeal, flour, eggs, milk, butter, a little sugar, baking powder. Mrs. Henderson measured everything out and talked Louisa through each step.
Louisa spent the afternoon lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to her. She had been in this camp for 4 months now. 4 months of eating better than she had eaten in the 3 years before capture. 4 months of watching American workers go about their lives with a casual abundance that seemed impossible. 4 months of realizing slowly and painfully that everything Il Duce had told her was a lie. She thought about her family in Naples. Her last letter from home had arrived 2 weeks ago. Her mother wrote that they were burning furniture to stay warm because there was no coal. Her little sister had been sick, but they couldn't afford medicine. Her father's shoe factory had been bombed, and he was out of work. They were eating potato peels and hoping for better times. Reading that letter while sitting in a camp where she had just eaten ham sandwiches for lunch had made Louisa physically ill.
"When I was a girl," Mrs. Henderson said, "my mama made cornbread almost every day. It's cheap and filling and good. Nothing fancy about it, just honest food." Louisa mixed the batter, poured it into a greased pan, and put it in the oven. 20 minutes later, she pulled out a pan of golden cornbread, steaming and perfect. She cut a piece and spread butter on it, just as she had that first night 4 months ago. She took a bite and tasted eggs and milk and butter and honey. She tasted abundance. She tasted the difference between a government that cared about its people and one that only cared about power. She understood now what she had learned in this prison camp. It wasn't about military strength or weapons or winning battles. It was about this. It was about having enough that you could feed your enemies. It was about treating people with dignity, even when you had every right not to. It was about the kind of strength that came from abundance shared, not hoarded. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. But the Italian women prisoners did not go home right away. There were forms to process, ships to arrange, priorities to sort out. Military personnel went first, then prisoners of war, organized by country and need. The Italian women waited through the summer and fall, still working in the laundry, still eating 3 meals a day, still trying to understand what would happen when they finally returned to the world they had left behind. Louisa and Giovanna were on the same ship home, leaving from New York in January of 1946. Before they boarded, Mrs. Henderson came to say goodbye. She brought gifts wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. For each woman, she had prepared a small package.
Inside were English dictionaries, thin and worn but still useful. There were recipes written out in Mrs. Henderson's careful handwriting, translated into Italian by one of the camp translators. The recipe for cornbread was there, along with instructions for biscuits and apple pie and fried chicken. There were photographs, too, pictures taken in the camp of the women working and eating and smiling. Pictures of Mrs. Henderson standing with her arms around Louisa and Giovanna, all three of them squinting in the Arizona sun.
Mrs. Henderson also gave them addresses, hers and several other American families who had worked at the camp. "Write to us," she said through the translator one last time. "Let us know how you're doing. You're not prisoners anymore. You're friends. Friends write to each other." Louisa held the package against her chest and tried to find words to thank this woman who had taught her how to make cornbread and, without meaning to, had taught her how to see the world differently. But the words wouldn't come. She just hugged Mrs. Henderson tightly and felt the older woman hug her back. The ship journey across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. The women stood on deck as they approached the Italian coast, straining to see the land they had left nearly 3 years before. Some women cried with joy. Some stood silent and afraid. Louisa felt both things at once. Her heart pulled in 2 directions. She was going home, but home was not the same place she had left. She was not the same person who had left it.
The ship docked in Naples in February of 1946. The city that Louisa remembered, already worn and tired from years of war, was now something worse. Buildings stood in ruins, their walls collapsed and their windows empty like dead eyes. Rubble filled the streets. Children in ragged clothes gathered at the docks, begging for food from anyone who might have some. Old women picked through garbage, looking for anything useful or edible. The cold winter wind blew through the destroyed neighborhoods, carrying the smell of smoke and sewage and despair.
The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, but the Italian women prisoners did not go home right away. Ships had to be arranged, paperwork processed, priorities sorted. Louisa and Giovanna finally boarded a ship from New York in January of 1946. Before they left, Mrs. Henderson came to say goodbye. She brought gifts wrapped in brown paper. Inside were English dictionaries, photographs from the camp, and recipes written in careful handwriting. The cornbread recipe was there, along with instructions for biscuits and apple pie. Mrs. Henderson also gave them addresses. "Write to us," she said through the translator. "You're not prisoners anymore. You're friends." The ship docked in Naples in February. Louisa walked through streets filled with rubble and starving children. Buildings stood in ruins. People picked through garbage looking for food. When she reached her family's apartment, her mother opened the door and Louisa barely recognized her. The woman who had been strong and solid now looked like a ghost, thin and gray and exhausted. Inside, the apartment was freezing. Most of the furniture had been burned for warmth. Her father and sister looked just as thin. Her mother served dinner, apologizing for having so little. The soup was made from potato peels and a little grain, barely enough to call a meal. Louisa looked at the watery soup and thought about Thanksgiving turkey and 3 kinds of pie. She managed 3 spoonfuls before she had to run to the bathroom and vomit. That night, her sister whispered in the darkness, "Was it terrible, being a prisoner? Did they hurt you?" Louisa couldn't lie. "No," she said quietly. "They fed us 3 meals a day. They gave us warm coats. They treated us like human beings." Her sister replied, "I'm glad you were safe, even if we weren't." That simple kindness made Louisa cry harder than she had cried at the feast. Giovanna's return to Sicily was similar. Her village looked smaller and sadder. The lemon groves were damaged. Her mother was thin, working in a garden that barely grew anything. They held each other and cried. That night, her mother served boiled vegetables and hard bread. It was everything they had. In the weeks that followed, Giovanna slowly taught her mother to make cornbread. Her mother was suspicious.
Corn is for animals, she said. But when she tasted it with butter and honey, she closed her eyes and sighed. It's good. They fed you this in prison? Giovanna nodded. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then maybe losing the war was not the worst thing that could have happened to you. Years later, Luisa was interviewed about her time as a prisoner. She said, "I learned more about freedom from cornbread than from all my fascist schooling. From a people so wealthy they could feed their enemies and treat prisoners like human beings, I learned that dignity doesn't come from conquest. It comes from abundance, shared, not hoarded."
Giovanna wrote to Mrs. Henderson in 1948. "You asked what I learned in Arizona. I learned that bread comes in many forms, that the real victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's having so much you can feed them and still call them honey. I make your cornbread for my children now. What you called ordinary, we called miraculous." The greatest argument against fascism wasn't a political speech, it was a kitchen. Winning hearts doesn't require force. Sometimes it just requires cornbread and the humanity to share it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.